the continuing series of workshops by the SSP, our Survey Research Statistics and Psychometrics new facility on campus. My name is Julia McQuillan, and I'm the acting director. And I'm very excited today to introduce our two speakers. Even though I'm listed as a co-author originally on this, I'm more of like a cheerleader because I've been learning from both of them, so it's kind of silly to have me actually presenting. First, we're going to have Dr. Belli. He's an applied cognitive psychologist who joined faculty in 2002 at UNL. He is part of the Survey Research and Methodology program at UNL, which is also part of the Joint Survey Research and Methodology program. And do you want me to say more about you, or do you want to talk about yourself?
I thought that was good.
Okay. As you'll learn, he's got a tremendous amount of expertise in the cognitive aspects of survey research, and you've all been benefiting from that here. And then Mindy Anderson-Knott. We're very proud to have her as one of our own graduates of the sociology department at UNL in 2000. And then she also worked for the Bureau of Sociological Research, which is part of the SSP. And we got her back from Penn State. Very excited about reversing the trend of people going to Penn State so that she could help us build the SSP. So she's our, well, technically facility manager, but basically assistant director. So we'll start with Bob. Thanks.
Sorry, Mindy, switch it around on, yeah. All right, I will be starting today, and I'm going to go over modes, basically, and cover kind of pros and cons to all the different options you have out there. I shouldn't say all, because there's no way I can touch on all the different options you have, but I'll cover as much as I can in 20 minutes. And then I'm going to hand it over to Bob, who's going to cover more of the actual development and cognitive testing and things like that that you can do to make yourself a high-quality instrument. So, what kind of data collection is best for me? What mode should you use? And there's several different considerations. I'm just going to hit on a few key ones, as much as I can cover again. So one of them is obviously cost. As much as we'd like to pretend that's not a consideration, it obviously is. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's the consideration that you're restricted because of cost. But there's different options you can do to try and use whatever money you do have the most effectively. Another is coverage, and that means you want to select your sample to get the best coverage that you can as far as the population you want to study. So there's different pros and cons for the different modes based on your coverage needs. Response rates, obviously you want as high of a response rate as possible, but depending on what your priorities are with your study, maybe response rate isn't that big of an issue, then there's a different mode for that. So kind of affects that. Time frame, how much time do you have to collect your data? If you have to have it collected real quick, then you want to use a different mode than if you have a lot of time and really want to focus on getting a high response rate and things. These all kind of interact with each other. So it's basically finding the highest priority of which of these and kind of designing your study around that. What kinds of data can be collected? Are you asking sensitive questions? Are you going to ask open-ended questions? Do you want to collect biological data? I mean, there's lots of different options out there for the kind of data. And then just some other issues that I thought I'd quickly touch on, such as missing data, flexibility, branching, overall quality, things like that. So, first of all, I thought one way to think about this is I'm going to give you 4 different scenarios on potential research studies. And you can keep these in the back of your mind as I go through all the pros and cons on these different considerations. And then at the end, we'll see if we can fit these into which mode would be best. So the first one is a master's thesis, which, surprise, surprise, has very little funding. And it's looking at a rare form of an eating disorder among college students. So that's one to think about. Another one is a well-funded complex study looking at stress levels and interactions among family members enrolled in a local parenting community program. A third one is looking at just basic satisfaction questions regarding retirement among members of AARP. So pretty straightforward stuff. And the fourth one is looking at opinions and attitudes among a nationwide sample of people who watched the press conference on a recent scandals event. So let's say something happened with the president and there was a little press conference and you want some data, to report at the end of the week how people reacted to that. So, all right, the first one is cost. Now, these numbers I threw out here, I put dollar figures in there, but do not take those too seriously because everybody, I just put them in there so you have some kind of concept what high, middle, low means, but there are so many variables that affect the cost. So these are very, very, very ballpark numbers, but I thought I'd at least give you something. Face-to-face it's usually the most expensive, but there are some designs that are cheap. Face-to-face covers a wide variety of kinds of interviews. So in this session, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the kind where you actually have a specific population, you're trying to schedule interviews, you're going to their house, or you're going somewhere and actually doing in-depth face-to-face interviews. You could also do like a mall intercept survey where you just show up and take your convenience sample, things like that. So those are obviously cheaper. But the ones where you actually have specific people you're trying to catch, schedule everything, they're fairly expensive. And that's because you have to send an interviewer to a place. You have to have a trade interview. They're usually fairly long a lot of times. And they just require the most work. Phone is probably the next highest, and that varies on whether you have a listed sample or if you're doing an RDD, which is a random digit dialing one, where you have to call 15 numbers before you even get one that is an actual household. And then you get a household, and then you have to get it when the people are actually there and able to do it. So it just requires quite a few different phone call attempts and everything to actually get somebody. Mail is about in the middle, and those expenses are basically variable on what kind of follow-up techniques and things that you're doing. So, it would be ideal if you can do a pre-notification letter, followed by the survey mailing, followed by a postcard, followed by another survey mailing, then doing another reminder, those kind of things, and they obviously add expense, and incentives also. And then web is usually the cheapest by far. And these are also, I should say, I'm assuming that this is a study of about like 500 completed interviews because they do fluctuate, because there's a fixed cost to setting up a study in whichever mode, and then there's variable cost depending on how many you have. Now web has the least variable cost because it's basically a fixed cost to program a study, and then you send out email invitations and things like that, but the data entry is being done by the respondent. There's not much variable there as far as, so you can do large ends because of that, so, but it's usually the cheapest. As far as coverage goes, face-to-face is usually the best. You can theoretically interview almost anyone. There's been studies done out there where with homeless people, and so obviously they don't have a phone, they don't have a mailing address, I doubt they have web access. So it's a population that's good for hard-to-reach populations like that. It's not very limited in that sense as far as who you can get. The limits usually come into if you want to do, like, let's say you just want to do a nationwide random sample, it's trickier to do face-to-face just because of the expense, because you usually have to cluster those into geographic regions. And so you do that because, let's say you hire an interviewer to cover, a little 3-city area or something. So they're housed there and they travel. Otherwise, they'd have to travel all over the nation all the time, and it's just terribly expensive. So usually that's done in clusters, and usually smaller ends, really, just because of the expense. Phone coverage is pretty good, but respondents must have a phone, obviously, which typically has not been a huge problem. Most people have phones, but it's becoming much more problematic than it used to because people no longer have landlines and are just having cell phones. And there's lots of research being done on how to adapt to these changes and things like that. But right now it is somewhat problematic. As far as coverage, an RDD, which is the random digit dialing, is fairly representative sample. So it's a good way of getting an overall representative sample. And what that is basically it assigns random numbers to those last 4 digits. You can pick your area from your prefix and things like that, but it gets you an overall random sample as far as people that have phones anyway. But you can also use lists, but they must be in good condition. If you have an outdated list with phone numbers that don't work, it doesn't really work as well. You can do tracking and try and find these people, but obviously it's best if you have a good list. Another coverage issue that's good with phone is that it's good for screening for eligibility. So if you're trying to reach a population but only a few people are eligible and you have no idea who those people are, so you need to talk to a nationwide sample to get them. But phone is good for that because you can have lots of conversations with people to try and screen and find the right people. Mail it's okay, but it usually requires access to a list. So a list is key to getting a good mail sample. And there's possible literacy issues. And web is probably the biggest issue with coverage because there's a limit on populations because they must have access to the web. It can be a perfect study for some populations. If you have a population that everybody has web access, then it's good for those kind of groups. It's best to have access to a good list of email addresses. You can send out like a letter with a URL and ask people to do the web survey, but it's best if you have their email addresses and you can send them an invitation that way. The biggest benefit to web probably is that you can have a really large N. You can send it to as many people as you want without the added cost. But don't get too excited about that and think that you can just send it to everyone, because a lot of times that's unnecessary and we don't want to overburden people with too many surveys. Response rates. And again, this one fluctuates in these numbers. Do not take literally again. I just thought I'd give you some kind of guideline because this depends on several factors as well. Face-to-face, I didn't even give an estimated because it's all over the board as far as what you can get. But typically, I mean, if you're doing it, spending a lot of money and doing a really high-quality face-to-face, you can get a really good response rate. Phone is okay, but it's declining because of a lot of the problems I mentioned before. People are also just a little more resistant to doing phone surveys. So again, there's a lot of research going on now to how to deal with this issue, but overall phone response rates are declining. Mail is okay. I would estimate between 20 and 40%. And web is typically poor. I would say 10 to 20% is the average. And like I said, this varies on so many different aspects as far as how the survey was designed, the topic of the survey, incentives, your population, all of those things factor into that. Time frame. So how much time do you have to collect your data? The face-to-face really varies. Like I said, if you're just doing something with a convenience sample in the mall, you can do it in one day. But typically, if you're doing the real in-depth face-to-face, it can take a lot of time, and that's just because it's a scheduling issue. You have to take your time to schedule with the respondents to find a time that works. CAPI, which is computer-assisted personal interviewing, speeds up the process. Sometimes people do face-to-face where they actually go out with a paper survey with the interviewer, and the interviewer writes the answers. There's an added step there because then after you have those paper surveys, somebody needs to go and data enter those in that whole step. So if you can take a laptop with you and do a computer-assisted personal interview, that speeds up the process a little bit. It also gives you some other benefits of added control. You can program in their skip patterns and things like that, which I'll mention later. Phone, it can be quick if needed. You can do, a really quick phone survey if need be. If you need to get some data right away the next day, it's very possible. The problem with doing it in too short of a time frame is that your response rate suffers, and that's because you don't allow yourself enough time to reach the people that you want to talk to. If you're only collecting data for a week, it really stinks if you happen to do it on a week that a lot of people are going on vacation for that week, because there's no way you're going to get them in that 1 week time frame. Whereas if you allow yourself 3 months, your odds are that you could reach those people a little bit better. So the longer you allow yourself, that's usually better. And again, you can do telephone on a piece of paper, you can write your answers, but another option is computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and that speeds up the process with the same reasons as the CAPI, where it's automatically the data being entered there and you have some extra controls. Mail is typically a slower method, and that's if you're using the appropriate follow-up, especially. Because if you're doing that, then you need to time your follow-ups to allow people to respond, and then bug them at the right time, and the more follow-ups, the better your response rate. So the longer you can field, usually the better. It's also, with all of these things, it's nice, the longer time frame you allow is nice, because if there's certain events going on that keep them busy during certain times of the year, it's good, like, if you are doing a nationwide sample, it's tough to get the farmers during this season, but it's tough to get another group during this season. So if you can do it for a longer time, you get all the people as much as you can anyway. And the web is a very quick turnaround. You basically have instant data. A lot of the web programs out there that actually collect your survey data allow you at any time to go in there. You don't even have to download the data. You can just print out, like you can just see some frequencies or some cross tabulations or something instantly on the data. So it's really handy in that sense. The different kinds of data that can be collected. You can basically in face-to-face, you can ask almost any type of question. CAPI, the computer-assisted personal interview, is great for complexity. It can deal with more complex surveys, and that is because you can program things in, but you also have an interviewer that can help kind of clarify and guide people through the process. You can use length and response scales, where you use response cards, which is where you actually hand somebody a little index card that has all your response cards, so you don't have to keep repeating them. They can actually have a visual prompt to help them answer the questions and things like that. And when I say lengthy response skills, it's like if you strongly agree, strongly disagree, but you have really long words for those instead, some other kind of category that is lengthy. And you can even use it for the short ones too. But. You can also examine nonverbal data, which is a huge benefit to this, where you can actually video record the interview, and you can use that data to do whatever you want with too, so it's kind of a nice added bonus. And you can collect biological data. While you're there talking to the people, you can get a spit sample from them and examine their cortisol level, their stress level. You can take their blood, you can do that stuff. And it's not that you're restricted in any of these things to just face-to-face. You can do, I've actually in the past collected biological data through a phone study. And that we sent them the kit, it was just collect their spit, so it wasn't obviously them collecting their own blood. But we sent them instructions on how to do it, and then when we talked to them on the phone, we explained to them, this is how we want you to do it, and told them when to do it, and things like that. So it worked, but obviously it works better when it's face-to-face because you have more control over that and know exactly how it was done. But as far as phone, CADDY's good for complexity. Scales with wordy response options are difficult. You can just imagine yourself as the interviewer saying some of these scales and repeating them over and over, and that it just doesn't come out very well over the phone. So you kind of want to make certain when you're programming, when you're creating a phone survey, that it's one that reads well when you're reading it aloud. And another benefit of the phone is that the data can be audio recorded. So you can't do the video recording for that, but you can do an audio recording, which is really nice if you want to ask an open-ended question. Typically in those, we have the interviewer typing as fast as they can to capture what they said, but it's obviously not perfect. You can audio record that piece and then have it transcribed and coded after the fact. Mail is good for sensitive questions. The downfall to face-to-face and phone, and that a lot of times people are reluctant to answer sensitive questions to another person. So there's a lot of under-reporting and things like that, whereas mail and web, you're able to do that and ask more sensitive questions. Mail is good for simple questions if it's pretty straightforward and doesn't need a lot of extra explanation, things like that. Open-ended data can be cumbersome for the respondent, and sometimes it can be illegible for data entry. So if you have a questionnaire that has a lot of open-ended, mail may not be your best choice just because it's a lot of work to ask the respondent to do, and you may not be able to read it when it comes back in. Web can handle some complexity. You don't want it terribly complex, but you can program in there different skip patterns and little prompts that tell people, help guide them through the process. And open-ended data can be cumbersome, probably less so than it is for the mail, but it is somewhat. And another thing is questions should fit on one screen. When you're actually designing it, you don't want to have a really long question that people have to scroll down because not everybody may scroll down and they may miss the bottom half of that. So, missing data. Face-to-face and phone are similar on this in that you can require an answer, and really you can't require an answer. The IRB will get a little upset with you, but you can try and prompt people and try and get as much as you can. If they absolutely refuse to give an answer, then in those situations, the interviewer can type a note into the computer and say, explain why they couldn't come up with an answer and say, they didn't fit this. This is what they said. That doesn't really fit into these categories, but this is what they said. But an interviewer can often, offer more information to avoid non-response. They can use probing to try and not push them into an answer, but encourage them to give an answer. They can clarify if the respondent has questions, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. The bad side of that is, we train our interviewers as well as we can, but they're human and they're all going to make mistakes. And so if they're giving different answers to the questions across the board, then that can be problematic. And then the interviewer also ensures that all questions are asked. So that obviously reduces your missing data because they make certain every question is asked and they try and get an answer to everything. Mail is the least control, and it can be a substantial problem. This is primarily true if you have a poor design. You can design it to try and capitalize and give yourself as much control and decrease your chances of missing data, but it's never going to be perfect. Questions can be skipped if it's poorly designed. Answers can be recorded incorrectly. A lot of times if you ask a question that asks for multiple response, or asks for a single response, but they select 3 different answers, it's basically missing data. Because if you ask somebody what their favorite color is and they list 3 different colors, you can't pick, well, I think they really meant blue. You have to report that as missing data. Web is the same kind of as face-to-face and phone where you can require an answer kind of, and what you can do is like if they hit next and try to skip an answer, you can have a prompt saying, well, are you sure you don't have an answer for this? And then maybe throw on there like a don't know or a no answer kind of option. And then if you can have online help to get this ways. Flexibility branching. Branching is basically guiding people through. If they answer one way to one question, then they skip this question and go to another one, that kind of issue. The Kathy and Caddy allows skip patterns to be programmed. If there's data entry error, so if the interviewer notices that they're getting questions after they shouldn't have, they can go backwards and fix that data on the fly and make sure it's correct. They can put in notes, allows flexibility to, if the questionnaire doesn't work right, they can write notes that explain what happened there. And then the benefit of those two is the changes can be made to an instrument study. If you found out halfway through your study that you forgot a very important response choice, you can program that and implement it and it's fixed. It's easier for phone because it can happen, it's all being done on site, and once you make the changes, they're instantly implemented. Face-to-face, if you're doing CAPI, you can have a system where people upload to the system every day and then they're getting the new version. So assuming that everybody's doing their job, it works. Mail is not great for skip patterns, but it can be possible. You just have to design, lay it out as best as possible using arrows and boxes and different things like that. But you obviously can't change the instrument. Once it's printed and sent out, there's not much you can do about it. Web is, you can put in skip patterns, and if a respondent enters the wrong data and starts getting branched to the wrong questions, they may be confused. They can back up and fix their answers, so that can go both ways. It can be a good thing or a bad thing. And usually you can't change the instrument once that one's finalized. Just some overall quality and control issues. Usually face-to-face and phone are fairly controlled settings, but there are interviewer effects possible, especially like I said, with sensitive questions and things like that. But generally they're usually pretty high quality. Mail, there's very little control over the quality. You have no idea who's completing the survey. You sent it to so-and-so and you assume they filled it out, but they could have given it to their 10-year-old daughter and she filled it out, and you don't know. Data can also be ineligible if you can't read it. Web is a little mix. It's reliable. It's more consistent than a human interviewer, but there's no human element, so you're not going to find out about problems as easily as you can with the face-to-face and phone. And there's no control over data entry errors or who completes the survey, so you just lack that element of control. Another couple options I'll just briefly touch on. Computer-assisted self-interviews and interactive voice recording. These are where you've got the benefits of a self-administered survey, but you also have the controls of having an interviewer. So these are some newer techniques that are trying to incorporate the best of both worlds to try and create another option that you have. It's more reliable than a human interviewer, but yet you can program in skip patterns and check for problems and things like that. Real quickly, I'm going to touch on mixed modes. You can combine modes. Typically, a lot of reasons to do it. One is to increase response rates. This may be where you start out with a mail survey, didn't get high response rates, so you follow up with a telephone survey to the non-respondents. Another is to reach different populations. So let's say you're doing a nationwide telephone survey, you're getting everybody, but you all of a sudden missed that Amish community. I came from Penn State, so I'm used to dealing with Amish communities. There's not a lot of telephones there. So you may need to go to those communities and do a face-to-face interview. Asking sensitive questions, but you also need an interviewer for other reasons. That's a case where you'd be doing a face-to-face interview with a laptop, and at one portion you hand the laptop over to the respondent and you'd let them do a computer-assisted self-interview. So then they do it themselves, and that's when you can ask those sensitive questions. A very common reason is to save money. So one, you may start out with a web survey because it's by far the cheapest, and then to the non-respondents you follow up with maybe a mail survey or something like that to try and increase your response rate. But one important thing to consider when you are doing mixed modes is that there is mode effects, and that respondents answer questions differently for different modes. For example, a very simple question such as marital status, you're going to get different answers because on a phone or face-to-face where you're just asking the question, what is your marital status? If you ask it open-ended, you're going to get more people that are going to say married or single, whereas if it's in a written form and they see the options, they're going to report separated, widow, divorced, whereas those people maybe just would have said, one of the other options. So even simple questions can get different answers. So now back to our examples. The master's thesis with very little funding, what would you guys say would be a good mode for that study? Julia thinks web. Good idea. Yes, a lot of the reasons just being that if there's not a whole lot of money there. You need a large sample because you're trying to find this rare form of the eating disorder. There's not going to be very many people that fall into this area. So you could send it to a lot of people to try and find those little group, and it's a sensitive question. The well-funded complex study looking at interactions among family members and a local community program. Anybody have any ideas? Julia came in. Face-to-face! Jamie wins! Face-to-face. And there's adequate funds to do it. You can videotape the interactions between the parents and the children and everything. You can collect biological data if you want to get at their stress levels. You can deal with complexity and lengthy data collection. So, good answer. Now, looking at basic satisfaction questions regarding retirement. And you can't pick one of the other two modes. So you're down to only 2 modes. So, anybody have any ideas? Mail, good idea. And this is also assuming that AARP is cooperating with me. They gave me this nice little mailing list. But it's a simple questionnaire. It's very basic. It would be a good one to do that. And looking at opinions and attitudes among a nationwide sample. There's only 1 mode left, so any guesses? Phone! Good idea. This is because it's nationwide, a quick turnaround. You can screen for eligibility, so if you only want to talk to the people that actually saw the press conference, you can screen that way, and it works pretty well. And now I'm going to hand it over to Bob. And at the end you can ask questions, but the time isn't up. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Great job. So now we're moving from the issue of different modes that people can use in collecting data to questionnaire design issues themselves and pretesting issues. And the goals of questionnaire design are, so we're moving from decisions about modes to the questionnaire itself. The questionnaire, of course, is this real key component. It's a key component in terms of all the data that you're going to collect is going to be collected via a questionnaire of some sort or another. So you have to write the questionnaire as well as possible. You also have to write the questionnaire with having various modes, possible modes in mind. But there's no such thing as writing a perfect questionnaire. No questionnaire is going to be understood by everyone exactly as intended. Instead, the goals are a little bit more limited. That is, one goal is to provide questions that can be understood by most respondents as intended most often. Another goal is to provide questions which people can retrieve and evaluate information accurately, and provide questions that kind of account for pitfalls, such as sensitive questions. There may be some aspects of questionnaire design that you can incorporate to reduce the sensitivity of questions, and at least understand context effects, question and response, option, order effects that may also be involved with regard to questions. That is, the answers to certain questions may be impacted by what questions you asked earlier, such as asking people how satisfied they are with their life. Following a question of marriage can actually impact how people respond to life, because they're likely to exclude their marriage in considerations of their life because they already answered a question on marriage, and thus, you already got that information. You must be asking me about life, not including my marriage. That can happen, and response order effects are dependent on mode. That is, how you order the response options will lead to people either providing a primacy effect, in which they would more likely answer the first items than the last items, or a recency effect, that they'll answer the last items instead of the first items, dependent on mode. So in a face-to-face survey, we put it this way, in a survey in which questions are asked only auditorily, it's the last response options that get processed initially by respondents, because they hear the entire list and they concentrate most often on that last response option due to a recency effect. Whereas if it's a mail survey or web survey, they're more, which is presented visually, they're more likely to concentrate on the first response option they can see. And that additional cognitive processing is which leads to the options which are processed initially is what leads to those response order, option order effects. And someone has to be aware of those in questionnaire design as well. When I teach questionnaire design, the first thing that I actually do cover is an analysis plan. That is, what are your questions about? And what definitions do you apply to what your questions are about, and they need to be defined with regard to your analysis plan. That is, what constructs are you to measure? Mindy, for example, talked about trying to capture satisfaction with regard to people who are retired. What kinds of constructs would go into satisfaction with retirement? What might you think might be some examples?
Money.
Okay, money. So you might want some questions with regard to their financial status, even with money. What kinds of constructs are involved in there? Savings, income. What else with retirement?
Volunteering.
Okay, whether or not they're engaged in any kind of perhaps productive kind of activity, leisure activity. So these are all constructs that one has to define, but not only define these constructs, one has to have a sense of why you want to measure these constructs and how you want to use this information analysis. So that's important as well. Then after you've worked through that part of the analysis plan, you have to translate constructs to questions. So you actually have to write a series of initial questions. Now, one thing that can help, for example, if you're dealing with an area which you're unfamiliar with, is to conduct some focus groups and ask various people what kinds of different aspects there might be to a particular mode of inquiry. One example I can think of is that some investigators are interested in the impact of AIDS on a gay community. They themselves did not really have a good understanding of how AIDS was impacting the gay community, and so they were able to gather together focus groups in those communities and actually ask people in those focus groups, get 6 to 8 people together, have some idea of what kind of constructs you want those folks to deal with, to sort of lay out the land in terms of getting a good understanding of how those people perceive their circumstances and the threat of AIDS to themselves and the community at large. So, once you have a questionnaire draft, there are 3 main methods in terms of trying to improve those questions. And the key idea here again is to try to write questions in which most respondents will be able to understand as intended. One of them is to ask for expert review. We've gathered a lot of information experts have about well-written questions and more poorly written questions, and experts can provide some information on what questions are likely to work well and what questions are not likely to work well. They can also give you some advice on question order effects and response order effects. Another method is what I'm going to call cognitive interviewing. That is actually taking some participants who come from the same population as you're trying to, that you're going to be using for the larger survey, and asking them in-depth questions with regard to what those questions mean to them, trying to observe any kind of retrieval problems that they may have, trying to observe any kind of judgment problems that they may have with those questions. That is, trying to understand the cognitive processes that people are going through while answering those questions, which can give you some insights on how to write those questions better. The third main method is an actual pretest, in which you actually implement your questionnaire in the field with a small subset of people. This is especially helpful if it's an interviewer-administered questionnaire, in which the interviewers now will give you a good understanding of how well that questionnaire has been constructed. If it's a computerized questionnaire or a CAPI questionnaire, you can observe some errors that may be involved in programming of the questionnaire. You can also observe, for example, how easy it is to actually administer that questionnaire in the field. And sometimes interviewers themselves may be able to observe some problems with the questionnaire and give you some advice with regard to whether or not those questions can be improved. And the important point is that you can implement all of these different methods on a single questionnaire. You don't have to choose one or the other. Of course, there are added costs to implementing all of these. So that's something else that people always have to take into consideration. As you indicated with cognitive interviewing, I'm going to concentrate primarily on cognitive interviewing, I think, during the remainder of this talk. The major purpose is to discover those problems in cognitive processing. I must say that once you discover problems, solutions may be harder to arrive at. That is, it's easier oftentimes to find the problems themselves than to find adequate solutions. And oftentimes this is an iterative process. And when you find some problems with questions, you change them according to the problems that you find, and then you have another round of cognitive interviews to see how all those questions have done. We talk in terms of questionnaire design and cognitive processing, and there being 4 processes that respondents have to engage in answering any question. They have to comprehend its meaning. They have to retrieve relevant information from memory. They may have to combine information together in judging their response. And then they have to format that response or deal with the formatting that's given to them in terms of response options. They have to match any kind of internal representation that they have on an appropriate answer to the external representation of the response options themselves. You can think, for example, with a question on retirement and satisfaction, returning to that example again, and asking people about their satisfaction with their leisure activities, for example, a question that might deal with that. And so, whatever that question's about, I don't want to write a question on the top of my head right now, but they have to comprehend that you're asking about certainly leisure activities. They have to retrieve instances of when they've engaged in leisure activities. They have to perhaps judge some activities that have been better and worse, and then they have to provide you with an answer on a satisfaction scale, not all satisfied, but perhaps very satisfied. So you can see how all those processes would be included in answering that kind of question. In terms of response, we oftentimes, or informants, oftentimes we talk about cognitive interviews dealing with informants and not response because they're giving you information on the quality of the questions themselves. We think about dozens, half dozens and dozens. I think as a good rule of thumb, a minimum of a dozen informants can be very helpful in terms of learning about real problems that you may have with questions that you've written. And 2 dozen is even somewhat better. So it's not really a very large, certainly not very large in terms of the number of participants that you need to get some useful information from this kind. A dozen or 2 dozen usually does fairly well. There are different kinds of techniques used in cognitive interviewing. There's the think aloud technique, which people are really to talk out loud anything that they would otherwise think to themselves silently. There's also structured probes, in which you actually you have written out a set of probes about particular questions in which you want to get the informant's reactions to, in terms of what they may have been thinking about the questions. Now we're going to talk about each of these in turn. To think aloud, you have to instruct respondents as their tasks. Basically, the task again is say out loud anything that you would otherwise say silently to yourself. You can provide reminder probes because sometimes people won't say anything. So you have to remind them to keep talking, tell me what you're thinking. Remember to think aloud. There has to be continual positive feedback with regard to people working and trying hard and thinking out loud. If respondents report difficulty, you encourage that because that's really what you want to know. You want to know what it is about those questions that are providing some problems for your informants. And these can be problems with understanding the question. These can be problems with trying to retrieve information. These could actually be problems in judgment, where they might not think that your response options adequately represent their own internal representations. All of those could be difficulty in trying to answer a question, and you want to encourage those kinds of responses. It's also important to set the frame of the think aloud technique up appropriately. People oftentimes think that you're testing them, and what you're really doing is testing the questions. So it's important for you to actually state that as well. Oftentimes, people are doing the interviewing in think aloud techniques will want to spontaneously follow up with some probes. You may want to ask people how to come up with that answer. As an example, the idea of the probing those is supposed to be done non-directly in a way that you don't bias the response. It may be easier said than done. And this technique can be used with regard to any particular mode, whether or not you have interviewer-respondent surveys or even self-administered surveys. How you set up the interviewing in these cognitive interviews should mirror the mode that you're using. So if it's an interviewer-respondent mode, you actually should set up a situation in which the informant is in a respondent chair, so to speak, and the interviewer is in an interviewer chair facing each other. If it's a telephone interview, you may actually want to do the think aloud over the telephone, though I don't think that's necessary. If it's self-administered, it's better if the interviewer were to sort of sit behind the informant and let the informant go through the questionnaire, the self-administered questionnaire, and read aloud. Not only think aloud, but also read aloud, because you may find some problems in terms of people being able to read the questions exactly as written. One researcher actually, when testing the census forms, did not even do anything but have a video camera, which was located above the informant, and saw where the informant was navigating through the self-administered questionnaire. And with initial drafts, found that the informant was not starting where the informant was intended to start in many instances, because it wasn't clear in terms of the packaging and everything else where one was to start on that census form, and that was improved. So even a simple observation can be helpful in a self-administered questionnaire. Of course, if it's web-based, then you just have the person sit in front of the computer and sit behind them and observe what they're doing. You still can interject in places. You can provide some spontaneous follow-up probes. If you notice, for example, a navigation mistake, you try to get some insight as to why that navigation mistake was made. But again, it's better to try to keep as much as possible the actual mode of administration preserved when you're doing these think aloud interviews. Is there any reason why I can't advance this anymore? Now, the idea of a think aloud is that it's particularly valid in the sense that people are providing you with an online output of what's in consciousness. It's not valid in the sense that people are providing necessarily truthful answers. That's not what I'm talking about with validity. I'm talking about observing problems in cognitive processing. And so as long as people are accurately reflecting the cognitive processing of what's in consciousness, that sets it as being available. We talk about that consciousness as information that's in short-term or working memory. Okay? It's there in your consciousness, it's there in your awareness, and as long as that information is not faded from consciousness and awareness, it's really quite valid with regard to at least what people are thinking about. And that's the whole purpose of the think aloud. Contrast that think aloud when people are actually thinking out loud while they're answering a question versus providing answers to the question and then 30 minutes later asking them how they answered that question. In 30 minutes time, people may have actually forgotten or not be able to reproduce the thought processes as they're actually answering the question. That's one benefit of this think aloud procedure. Also, you have to be cognizant that what you're collecting is descriptive information, not interpretive information. You're collecting descriptive information of the actual cognitive processes that people use while answering that question. You're not interested in why people think they answer the question a particular way. In fact, when people try to provide why responses, okay, I answered this question about leisure time positively because, I really enjoy my pet, that kind of thing. You have to take that kind of thing with a grain of salt. Descriptively, that sort of tells you that this person is thinking about their pet while answering the question. That can be useful. But you don't take the why information at face value. You have to make your own judgments as to whether or not you're observing some problems with the question. So here are some examples. And this is a question with regard to assistive devices, such as people using canes, wheelchairs, or hearing aids. And so you might ask a question, how long has John used the cane? One problem with how long that was observed with the think aloud was that it was ambiguous. Some people use these devices intermittently. They may use a cane for a week and then stop using it and so forth. And that also presented a difficulty because people were curious whether or not, well, are you talking about the cane, the nice new cane that John currently has? Or, are you talking about even the old discarded item that John had used a while ago? Okay, it wasn't quite clear from this question. These are clear indications of comprehension problems, and a revision based on the think aloud, which clearly improved this question, was asking how long ago did John first use a cane? Okay? At least it's clear in the sense that, you sort of said, we're just interested in the time when John first used a cane to when John to now. Now the issue is this, you're not collecting information on intermittent uses of the cane, which may be important to you. So one of the things that that sometimes gets resolved when you're doing these think aloud processes and getting information from the think aloud is that the researcher has to think through what information is truly relevant for my purposes. Okay? It may be different than what you originally had thought based on what information people can provide to you. Now, this is an interesting observation with regard to avoiding why responses. So someone might, in a radon questionnaire, ask, what is the primary reason you have not tested your home for radon? And respondent try to construct a response. They're giving all sorts of explanations. They're giving wide responses. But it really was apparent that people really never thought about this before. And so this was a retrieval problem. People never really encoded this to begin with, and the solution was simply to move the question. The real advantage of think aloud is that the interviewer does not impose their own bias on responses, and you can learn many new things. And it's an open format with potential for unanticipated information. Some people think that the think aloud is unnatural. That might be a disadvantage. You do need some very verbal response for it. It doesn't have higher respondent burden to it, higher burden on the part of the informant. People may wander off task, and you have to be supportive to try to keep people on task. It's not clear whether or not people are using a manner in which they would actually answer these questions in the field because they're sensitive now more to the questions in terms of going through the think aloud process. It's not clear. There's been some debates on that. It's not good to expose non-conscious processes. It's really not directly a lot of processes that people engaging cognitively do not arise to conscious awareness. You may have a coding problem because you're collecting verbal stream information and somehow you may have to deal with that. Oftentimes it's just looked at qualitatively. The response, if you make some notes with regard to problems that you've observed and see if they are consistent among questions and the same among all of your informants or a good proportion of them. And if you're probing spontaneously, that can introduce some bias. Nevertheless, think aloud, regardless of the disadvantages, that shown to be quite useful. Structured probes are best if you sort of have identified some suspected problems in advance. And so you design some probes in advance. You can actually, as I indicated, combine these structured probes with any kind of think aloud technique that you want to use. If you do a series of think alouds and you're beginning to observe some consistent problems, you might want to design some probes on the basis of that to see if your hypotheses and make sure the problems are correct. And it might be possible to look at these structured probes with regard to all four cognitive processes. In my own experiences, that tends to be best for comprehension problems with the structured probes. So here's one example through the past 12 months since March 1st of 2006, about how many days did illness or injury keep you in bed for more than half the day. An obvious comprehension issue might be what half of the day means to people, so you might want to actually provide a probe to that effect. What does half the day mean to you? What do you think of by half the day? Either of those would be appropriate. Another technique is to have your informants paraphrase a question. Did anyone in your household receive income from wages, salaries, fees, rents, interest, dividends, or commissions the past 12 months? Well, this poses obvious problems. You then ask you to repeat the question in your own words, in which people can't keep track of all this information in short-term memory. Okay, you've given them too much detail, which they can maintain awareness of. So you can examine whether the questions are too complex or just a simple paraphrasing technique. My diagram went away. Okay, so something before that you lost that particular. There was a diagram. And that one away. So this won't make sense to you without that diagram. The point of this is that people, yeah. Is it in there? The point of this is that people were unclear what the abdomen was, and so if you presented them with a diagram in which you layered out from the top of the torso down and had different areas numbered, people were just pointing all over the place as to what they thought the abdomen was, okay? And that was the probe that was used. Instead, what was better was then to actually have a question with the diaphragm located and simply ask people, do you experience pain in this area? Okay? So that was what was done in that particular structured probe. Sometimes it may be obvious to people that there are going to be certain problems with questions, but if you're actually doing some work on the benefit of a contract to a researcher who has written questions, it's oftentimes good to provide some evidence as to why the questions pose the problems. You may want to do these structured probes just for that reason. The advantages, in contrast, I think allows the structured probes are a situation which informants do not need a whole lot of practice. The disadvantages is that now you've sort of heightened your informants that there might be some problems with these questions, and they may be engaging in processes that they would not ordinarily engage in an actual field situation. I talked a little bit about pretests in terms of conducting a mock data collection with a subset of retargeted sample. This could be a follow-up then to think aloud or other kind of interview techniques such as structured probing. Certainly you want to do this to assess how well a survey instrument will operate in the field, assess how long the questionnaire is, whether or not it's too long, whether or not you can actually increase it, which hardly ever happens. People will always write questionnaires that are too long. Observe any kinds of item non-response problems that may exist. That's also a good thing to observe if questions are just simply not being answered. And again, as indicated, any technical administrative problems can be observed with the pretest. Interviewers also can provide some insights into question problems. It's also possible with these pretests to engage in verbal behavior coding, where you begin to look at, if you record the streams of verbal behavior between the interviewers and respondents, you can code those verbal streams for such things as observing when a response or asking for clarification, which means if the question poses some comprehension problems, where interviewers not reading the question exactly as written, which means the question isn't fully written. You may have to revise that question, or other kinds of behaviors along those lines. Okay, so what are you going to do if you are in the midst of trying to write a proposal? Well, I think there are various strategies here. First of all, it's real important that you have a clear analysis plan, at least especially regarding the constructs that you want to measure. You may not be able to develop an entirely perfected questionnaire at the time of proposal writing. Nevertheless, what you can do is that you can, in your proposal, state that you're going to have a round of cognitive interviews and pretests to help improve the questionnaire. Reviewers like to see that kind of language. If you need, of course, assistance with this, I think it makes sense in terms of your proposals to actually budget in some time for SSP or for neurosociological research in order to help you with your questionnaire development. So I think that those are some of my final comments here. I don't know if I have some additional time because I do have another example.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Maybe 3.
Maybe 3. Okay. So let me just another example I have of I'll get rid of the This question was asked to 10-year-olds in a cognitive interview situation. Does your mother or stepmother live at home with you? And all of these children had both parents that lived at home with them. There were some surprising problems with this question. Children would say such things as, well, I don't have a stepmother, so it must be no. Okay? So the Boolean logic of mother or stepmother was not understood as intended. Other children would say such things as, well, and this is usually does your father or stepfather live with you, at home with you? Well, my father goes to work during the day, and when I come home from school, he's not there. So I guess he doesn't really live at home with me. He sort of does, but he probably doesn't. Okay? So what appears to be a very straightforward question, you can observe with this is done with think aloud technique. And with children, who, by the way, are great with think alouds because they don't have these social barriers. They're just natural think alouders anyways. They're just going to tell you anything that's on their minds. They're really good at this task, which was a bit of a surprise for us. But what seemed to be a very straightforward question turned out to be not at all straightforward. And it actually posed some problems in terms of trying to derive some solutions as to try to get some information about the household situation. So that's, again, just an illustration of how I think aloud technique and cognitive can help you at least identify the problems of the questions and provide some potential for improvement. I guess my time is up.
It said that you should not pretest in the questionnaire the population where you are going to understand. Is it so?
You should pretest it with the same. You should pretest it with the same population that you have in mind for the large study.
Is that so?
Is that so?
Yeah.
Yes, you should.
Really?
Yes.
Because you want to make certain.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Because you want to make certain those people, like the people that you're testing with, you want it to be the exact same people that you're actually going to be doing the study with.
You want to generalize the results from the pretest to the population you're actually going to study, because you may observe different problems in different populations. And so if you use a different population, I mean, it's a subset of the population. It's a group. You have a white population. You have a group of people who have the same characteristics as to your target population. That's what we mean by a subset. It's obviously not the same people that you're going to interview later on in the regular study, but you're going to pretest those kinds of people who have the exact same characteristics as your target population. That's what I mean by that.
Yeah. In a large sample surveys, these pretest people may end up in your subjects.
Well, you have to avoid that. You should avoid that, yes. You should not be interviewing people twice in the same
Sometimes, like if you have, like let's say you have a sample of 100 people, and you're going to send your survey to this group, you want to draw your sample and pull those pretest people out, and then they're no longer in this pool that you can then go to when you actually do your survey. So if you have a really small population, it does get tricky.
It does pose very big problems if you have a small population.
Yeah,
but most populations are larger than just 100 folks. Any other questions?
Would you
pretesting or think aloud in another subset of the population?
Yes, it would
Just
be
for
again.
the same reason?
Yes, that's exactly right.
I have a question for you. Would you recommend like doing different kinds of techniques with your, like maybe do your first, if you're doing a dozen of them, do the first 6 with the think loud and the last 6 more structured? Or do you have like a continuum where you kind of do a little bit of mix of both techniques along the way?
Yeah, I think that the best approach is a mixed approach, in which you will think aloud and have some structured probes identified in advance. That is possibly giving them the most impact and gain the most knowledge with the least amount of cost. It's always, there's always going to be certain parts of questionnaires you can really wonder yourself, like people don't really understand this question, understand this term, understand this phrase, and you can write a structured program. At the same time, you can then do the think aloud. Sometimes people don't always convey everything that is possible. So you may miss something with the think aloud that you're actually going to catch with that structured program. So combining both in one instrument actually is quite practical and has shown to be useful.
And if you really don't know where to start from, I know in our class we had a stage where we just did open-ended interviews from the beginning. So maybe if you weren't at all sure about what were possible response options, but that might again be costly. I mean, you can cover the same things if you're the general idea.
Yeah, if you're trying to develop response options, that might be a strategy to use, is to try to get people to provide an open-ended response, which may give you some clues as to what response options will work best.
Thank you all for coming, and I'd also mention that next week, next Friday, we're doing a presentation on non-response issues and how to deal with it and everything like that. So, hopefully you come to that. Oh, and fill out your evaluations. You just leave them out here. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened to that slide. I used to them.
That's all right, as it was live demonstration.
Yeah, that was actually good.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that kid example, the first time I heard that, I was like, are we working mother and